Spring 1943, high over occupied France, where the air is thin, the sun is hard, and every breath is borrowed from an oxygen line. Seasoned Luftwaffe pilots scanned the sky and saw shapes that didn't fit their instincts. Not sleek, not delicate, not the kind of fighter that looked like it belonged in a knife fight. What climbed toward them looked like an American contradiction. Huge through the fuselage, thick in the wings, a blunt-bodied machine hauling itself upward as if altitude had to be wrestled into submission. In that first glance, it was easy to dismiss it as a mistake, something built by people who didn't understand European air combat. But war has a way of punishing laughter, not with speeches, but with consequences. Because the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt didn't arrive to win a turning contest. It arrived to survive, to strike, to return, and to come back again and again until the sky itself changed ownership. It would become one of the most famous Army Air Force's fighters of the war, first as a high-altitude escort, and then as a fighter-bomber that made daylight dangerous for anything moving below. The first Americans to fly the P-47 into combat over Western Europe weren't showing up as legends, they were showing up as students who had to learn under pressure, in public, against an enemy with years of experience. The Thunderbolts' early operations in 1943 were shaped as much by small practical problems as by big tactical ones. Some of the first sweeps were undermined by radio failures, coordination breaking down at the exact moment when coordination mattered most. And the solution was as unglamorous as it was decisive. Refits and fixes, including British radios, until the aircraft and the organization could function together. Missions resumed on April 8, 1943, and on April 15, Major Don Blakesley scored the Thunderbolts' first aerial victory in the European theater, an early signal that the big fighter could fight, even if it had to fight differently. That different started with why the airplane existed in the first place. The P-47 was born from the anxiety of 1940, when German air power seemed to be rewriting the map, and the United States realized that any future conflict would be decided not only by bravery, but by altitude, speed, and staying power. The requirement called for a high-altitude interceptor that could meet enemy fighters where the air itself becomes an obstacle. The Thunderbolt's answer was unapologetically large, a single-seat fighter built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine and a turbo supercharger system that let it keep its power in the thin air where other aircraft began to wheeze. Accounts of the type's performance emphasize exactly that point. The turbo supercharger helped the P-47's power plant deliver its best performance around 27,000 feet, and above 30,000, the aircraft remained fast and competitive compared to many opponents.
On paper, it looked like raw muscle. In the air, it felt like learning a new language. The Thunderbolt's size came with quirks that punished carelessness, especially when pilots were transitioning from lighter fighters. Training accidents happened, and the airplane gained a reputation among some crews for being demanding, even unforgiving. But the same traits that made it challenging also made it extraordinary. It was built to take punishment. It carried armor protection for the pilot, and it flew with the kind of structural confidence that made pilots feel like they were inside a machine designed to keep them alive long enough to learn from their mistakes. When people later described the P-47 as one of the toughest Allied fighters, they're not talking about mythology. They're talking about an aircraft that could be damaged badly and still remain controllable, still remain airborne, still give a man a chance to cross water and see home.
Early in combat, the skeptics weren't completely wrong about its weaknesses.
A P-47 didn't want to turn like a lightweight interceptor, and it didn't want to climb like the most nimble fighters at low and medium altitudes. If you tried to fight the old way, if you let pride pull you into a turning duel, you could die in a machine that was never designed to win that kind of argument. That's what made the Thunderbolt such a brutal teacher. It forced pilots to choose discipline over impulse. It forced them to decide, in the middle of adrenaline, to refuse the fight they wanted and take only the fight they could win. And while the enemy tried to exploit the Thunderbolt's turning and climb limitations, something kept interrupting the narrative. Thunderbolts were coming back. They were coming back torn open, systems failing, skins peppered, yet still flying.
Then there was the other half of the Thunderbolt's personality. What happened when it finally got its nose where it wanted it? The P-47's standard armament is often summarized in a way that reads like a warning label. 8 50-caliber machine guns with 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total. That number doesn't sound dramatic until you picture what it means in a firing pass. An American fighter that can keep a sustained stream of heavy bullets on target far longer than many opponents expect, building a wall of lead in front of it instead of a brief snap. The Thunderbolt's firepower wasn't about elegance, it was about certainty. When those 8 guns converged, the target didn't just get hit, the target got overwhelmed. In an air war where fractions of a second decide whether you live, the ability to put massive, concentrated fire on a target in a short window changed the psychology of the fight. The story that turned that toughness into legend happened on June 26, 1943. 48 P-47Cs from the 56th Fighter Group launched to escort B-17s returning from a mission near Paris, and near Forges-les-Eaux they were attacked by FW-190s. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was flying at the rear when the first pass chewed into his aircraft. Accounts describe 20mm cannon shells tearing through his Thunderbolt, rupturing his hydraulics, shattering his canopy, wounding him with fragments and bullets. His cockpit filled with chaos, fluid spray, broken glass, smoke, the sense that the airplane was coming apart around him. At one point, he tried to bail out and discovered he couldn't. The damaged canopy track left him trapped inside a wounded aircraft at high altitude.
What happened next is where the P-47 becomes more than a machine in the mind of anyone hearing the story. Johnson managed to regain control and level out, pointing the crippled fighter toward the channel. He had limited visibility and failing systems, but the Thunderbolt kept flying. Then a German fighter found him again, one more predator circling a limping prey, and opened fire repeatedly. Johnson couldn't outturn him, couldn't outclimb him, couldn't outfly the situation in any romantic sense. So he did the only thing left. He held on, trusted the armor, trusted the airframe, and tried to keep the aircraft stable enough to stay alive. In Johnson's later account, the German pilot eventually pulled alongside and, after pouring fire into the still-flying wreck, rocked his wings in what Johnson interpreted as a brief salute before breaking away. The identity of that German pilot has been debated and remains unverified, but the core of the episode is consistent. The Thunderbolt absorbed an incredible amount of punishment and still brought its pilot home.
Johnson landed back at Manston, and the damage was so extensive that the aftermath becomes its own kind of image. Mechanics and officers staring at a P-47 that looked like it should have been falling in pieces over France. Johnson reportedly began counting holes and stopped after the tally passed 200. In war, stories spread because they solve a problem inside people's minds. This one solved fear.
It told American pilots that their machine could give them a margin no other fighter might. It told German pilots that the rules they trusted weren't universal, that there was now an aircraft in the sky that did not die when it was supposed to. And once that realization sinks in, every tactical choice changes. You don't chase the same way. You don't commit the same way. You don't expect the same outcome from your ammunition. But toughness alone doesn't win. It only buys time. And time is what the Thunderbolts pilots used to learn the airplane's true identity, energy. The P-47 didn't need to win by turning tighter. It needed to win by refusing to turn at all. It needed altitude like money in the bank, stored potential you can spend in one violent transaction. From height, the Thunderbolt could dive like a dropped anvil, converting altitude into speed, hitting the fight with momentum the enemy couldn't instantly match. And then, instead of staying to duel, it could climb back out in a zoom, turning speed back into altitude while opponents bled energy behind it. The turbo supercharger that let the P-47 remain strong at altitude wasn't just a technical detail, it was the foundation of a doctrine. Climb high, strike hard, and leave before the enemy can drag you into the fight you can't win.
This is where early ridicule, real or rumored, turns into something else: caution. The Thunderbolt forced a kind of humility in the air. When a P-47 was flown wrong, it looked clumsy. When it was flown right, it looked inevitable. That inevitability is what made it such a powerful escort fighter in its early European role. It could operate at the high altitudes where bomber streams lived. It could absorb damage in the chaos around those formations, and it had the firepower to punish interceptors that misjudged a head-on pass or crossed into the wrong firing lane. And even as the long-range escort job increasingly shifted toward other types later in the war, the Thunderbolt's strengths didn't fade, they shifted. It became one of the most effective fighter bombers of World War II, precisely because its durability and payload potential made it ideal for repeated punishment missions over hostile territory. The P-47's evolution into a ground attack terror wasn't a footnote, it was a second identity. A fighter bomber isn't simply a fighter carrying bombs, it's a pressure system. It turns roads into risk. It turns rail yards into targets. It forces an army to move at night and hide by day. The Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs and also mount rockets. 10 5-inch rockets are a commonly cited configuration, while still retaining those 8 guns for strafing. And because it was rugged, it could survive the kind of low-altitude environment where ground fire is constant and unforgiving. The result wasn't just destruction, it was paralysis. When an aircraft can appear quickly, hit hard, and withstand the chaos long enough to escape, it doesn't merely attack targets, it attacks confidence.
If you want proof the Thunderbolt wasn't only a European story, look to the Pacific and to the kind of leadership that turns an aircraft's strengths into doctrine. Colonel Neil E. Kirby became one of the Thunderbolt's defining pilots in that theater, shaping tactics around altitude, diving attacks, and disciplined firing passes. The same "don't turn with them, don't fight their fight" philosophy in a different sky. On October 11, 1943, Kirby volunteered to lead a small flight of 4 P-47s on a reconnaissance sweep over Wewak, New Guinea, and ran into a vastly larger enemy formation. What followed lasted close to an hour and ended with Kirby credited with 6 enemy aircraft shot down in a single mission, an action for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The point isn't the scoreboard, it's the lesson. The Thunderbolt could dominate when it fought on its terms, even against numbers, because its performance at altitude and its firepower let it strike decisively and survive. And hovering above every personal story, above every ace, every lucky escape, every hard-won tactic, was the force that truly decides an attrition war: production and sustainment. The P-47 was built in staggering numbers. By war's end, 15,683 Thunderbolts had been produced, more than any other U.S. fighter.
That number isn't trivia. It's strategy. Air war isn't one battle. It's a campaign of repetition. Thousands of sorties, thousands of takeoffs, thousands of landings, thousands of maintenance cycles in cold mud and tight schedules. A fighter that can be built, repaired, supplied, and flown again and again becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a rhythm that the enemy has to endure. The Thunderbolt represented a kind of American industrial logic in the sky. Not a single perfect blade, but a relentless machine of pressure that could keep showing up. That difference became brutally clear in the winter of 1944-45, when the Luftwaffe attempted one last great surprise, Operation Bodenplatte, on January 1, 1945, a low-level strike meant to cripple Allied tactical air power by hitting advanced airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. The RAF Museum's timeline captures the scale. Over 800 German fighters and fighter bombers launched, achieving surprise, destroying 224 Allied aircraft and damaging 84 beyond unit repair. But surprise is not the same as recovery. Aircraft on the ground can be replaced if your system can replace them. Experienced pilots cannot. Accounts of Bodenplatte emphasize how costly the operation was for German air power, losses in pilots and leadership that the Luftwaffe could not afford so late in the war. The Allies absorbed the hit and kept flying. The Luftwaffe spent what remained of its substance. The logic of endurance won again.
That's why the Thunderbolt's legacy isn't really a fat plane that proved everyone wrong. It's deeper than that, and frankly, more American than most people realize. It's the story of how a nation built a fighting system that could keep learning faster than it was being bled. The P-47 did not win because it was pretty. It won because it was built for the war that actually existed. High altitude, long hours, flak, fuel calculations, and the grim reality that you can't be brilliant if you don't survive long enough to get good. It won because it carried a gun battery that could end an engagement in seconds. It won because it could carry real ordnance and come back through the mess. And it won because it could be produced, serviced, and flown at a scale that turned individual skill into sustained dominance. So picture that first spring over France again, the pale air, the veterans circling, the temptation to laugh at the heavy silhouette climbing toward them. What they were really watching wasn't a joke. They were watching an idea arrive, an idea that says survival is a weapon, firepower is a language, and endurance is how wars are decided. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not need to outturn its enemy to defeat it. It needed to outlast it. It needed to keep coming back until the enemy's margin for error became zero. And once you understand that, you understand why, for the men who flew it and for the men who faced it, this aeroplane didn't feel like a machine. It felt like momentum. It felt like the future pressing down from above.